Hello, my name is Radina Anggun Nurisma. I come from Politeknik Elektronika Negeri Surabaya. Today I'm going to deliver my paper entitled The Student Created Podcast to Facilitate EFL Speaking, a Case Study in Online Environment. So here, basically, I conduct this study on my institution, Politeknik Elektronika Negeri Surabaya, and I carry out this study based on these several points. The first one, the growing movement of online learning at the tertiary education level. As we know, online learning is commonly used, especially during this pandemic, and it brings me an idea how to use technology on my teaching. However, lack of awareness about what teachers students do with technology and its benefits within the online learning environment. So I still found some of the teachers are not really aware with the use of technology and how to get the benefit uh, from this technology on their teaching and learning activity. And then the third one, of course, because this is not online learning, some of the students might feel that they don't get much exposure to practice their speaking like what they used to have in face-to-face interaction. Um, it brings me an idea how to use technology on my teaching. Some of the educators agree that the use of new technology might help them a lot in their profession. In addition, students have the same feeling that learning with the implementation of new technology has become more engaging and fun. And one of the most influencing media that I use for teaching and learning language is media. That is podcasts. The benefit mostly come from its practical use that makes language learning easier and more satisfying. And if you look at these previous studies, recently educators begin to recognize that podcast is an effective tool in language teaching and learning. Most of the recent studies have proved that podcasts can be implemented in the field of English teaching and learning. And here I try to relate the state of online learning in Polytechnic and with the idea in my study. The first one, the absence of effective communication during online learning with teachers and peers. And then the second one is lack of exposure to practice on speaking, especially on the development of productive skills. And then the last one, most of English teachers do not know how to use technology for teaching purposes. So I'm trying to minimize the problems or the issues encountered by the students by having technology in my teaching. That is podcast. The challenges is the first one, of course, the idea or the ability to communicate reasonably effectively. So I'm questioning about whether the effective communication can assist with the use of technology in this teaching and learning process. The first one is, of course, as an educator, as a teacher, I have to set a well-organized lesson sequence, which reflects ELT principles. And then the third one is we have to make sure the technological literacy between the teacher and students, how the teacher and student can master um, the use of podcasts, how to operate the podcast itself. So it's very important to know that the lesson itself needs to be designed in such a way so that it reflects best practice in terms of theories and principle of language learning. So the concern is not the technology itself, but the um, the teaching principle, how the technology might support uh, the teaching learning process, but the teaching principle itself should be rule first. And here the three key aspects in facilitating speaking in online English course. So basically the idea comes from the second language acquisition inspired pedagogy. So how the technology use this kind of SLA inspired pedagogy on their teaching process. The first one, we have to consider the language input, then language interaction, and then language accuracy and fluency development. So I formulate the research question on my study into two questions. The first one, what are the students' perceptions toward the use of podcasts in practicing English speaking? The second one is, what are the problems that are encountered by the students while using podcasts? And this is the methods of data collection. So basically, I use case study here, and I use this kind of instrument to collect the data from the respondent, like in-depth interview and then questionnaire, and then observation of the online teaching and learning activities, and documents such as lesson plan and materials. And the last one is the transcription from conversation in podcasts. The subject of study is 120 students from Polytechnic Elektronika Negeri Surabaya. And then for each class, the student classroom population is probably more or less more than 20 students. And then the last one, besides the um, the point in or the aspects in teaching and learning process, I also analyze the instrument by using content analysis technique on these several instruments. And then this is the finding. The first of all, based on the roles of English teacher here, I'm trying to set the rules. Uh, I'm trying to figure out how I supposed to conduct the role of English teacher well. The first one, planning the materials, and then delivering the materials, giving assignment, assessing the students. And most importantly is how I supposed to facilitate the online discussion by holding rules and procedures of discussion. It's very important to determine the success of um, students' activity later on to create the podcast. So as a teacher, we have to set the rules, clear rules or procedure about the lesson sequence based on the ELT principles. So here is the procedure or the lesson sequence. The first one, it is based on the language input, how the teacher should give the model podcast from internet sources, and then the teacher highlight typical structure and language feature. So it's time for the students to process the input from the teacher and recognizing some of the language features used here. After that, the students can practice in small groups. Students share and exchange ideas, and then after have holding some discussion with their friends, students can create a script and rehearse their presentation, then have their presentation recorded in audio podcast. And then it's time for teacher to give some feedback for the students, and student might reflect, finding out some of the errors and revise later, and then the end of the lesson. So I set this kind of procedure or the lesson sequence based on the model of teaching speaking cycle from Go and Burns. This is the sample of conversation transcription of audio podcast in online learning, and this is the compilation of audio podcast in online learning. And I can figure out the accuracy and the fluency development from the students from the conversation here based on the scoring criteria from Hayden. And then this is the questionnaire result of the student perception towards the use of podcast. So mostly the student give positive attitude toward the use of podcasts. And then the problem encountered by the student mostly related to technical problems. Most of them are not familiar to operate or to create a podcast before, but as the time passes, they can learn how to create, they can learn how to record their voices. And then the last percentage is on the anxiety. Most of the students can overcome their fear to speak up, because they already hold the rehearsal before uh, with their friends in groups. And then the least percentage is on the resources. So most of the students have problems on the internet connection, and then also the use of the sophisticated gadget to support their recording. And then this is the observation result for the teacher and student interaction. So basically, most of the students can overcome the fear of speaking, and then students were motivated and found it helpful to speak English using podcasts. And then there is two-way communication between teacher and students. Uh, this is this is the space for the teacher to give feedback, and then the students uh, might have their uh, feedback from the teacher, and then to revise the errors later on. So this is the conclusion. Uh, Students have positive attitude towards based on the data collected from the instruments. And then teaching speaking with podcasts can be used as an alternative way to engage students as long as the lesson sequence reflects ELT principles. And then the last one, the problem encountered by the students to create a podcast is mostly related with the technical stuffs, because most of them are not accustomed to use or to create a podcast before. This is the future recommendation. The first one is more collaborative projects for the students to facilitate interaction. And then pedagogical instruction is the most important for the students to guide them into speaking practice. However, um, yes, it is true that skillful implementation of online lesson can enhance a language course, but should not undermine the value of student interaction with EFL teachers. So basically here the interaction between student and teacher uh, plays an important part, plays an important role uh, to build the student fluency development itself. So not the technology alone, but also the teacher's role to set the rules on pedagogical stuffs. All right, that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you for your attention.